Welcome students. This session is for BA second year English Literature paper first, that is Poetry and Drama. In this session we will be doing poem Sohrab and Rustum by Mathew Arnold. Mathew Arnold was born on December 24, 1882, Neilham, Middlesex, England, and he died April 15, 1888, Liverpool. Before we look at the text of the poem, let's have a look at Arnold's life and works. Arnold began his career as a poet, winning early recognition as a student at Rugby School, where his father Thomas Arnold had earned national acclaim as a strict and innovative headmaster. Arnold also studied at Balliol College, Oxford University. In 1844, after completing his undergraduate degree at Oxford, he returned to Rugby as a teacher of classics. After marrying in 1851, Arnold began work as a government school inspector, a grueling position which nonetheless afforded him the opportunity to travel throughout England and the continent. So he was connected to this school teaching where his father was an innovative headmaster, and Arnold also, after graduating from Oxford, he started his work as a school inspector of government, and this gave him an opportunity to travel to various places. Throughout his 35 years in this position, Arnold developed an interest in education, an interest which fed both his critical works and his poetry. So a lot of his work is influenced by his travel and his interest in education. Empedocles on Etna, 1852, and poems, that is 1853, established Arnold's reputation as a poet, and in 1857 he was offered a position which he accepted and held until 1867 as a professor of poetry at Oxford. So he was given this position of a professor of poetry for nearly 10 years. Arnold became the first professor to lecture in English rather than Latin. During this time, Arnold wrote a bulk of his most famous critical works, Essays in Criticism, that is 1865, and Culture and Anarchy, that is 1869. So these two critical works are quite famous, in which he sets forth ideas that greatly reflect predominant values of the Victorian era. So the effect of his age is reflected in his critical works. Let's have a look at poetic style of Mathew Arnold, especially in the poem Sohrab and Rustum, which is there in your course. Sohrab and Rustum is the noblest poem in English language. It is said that it's nearest analog in English to the rapidity of action, plainness of thought, plainness of diction, and nobleness of humor. So we will see that this poem Sohrab and Rustum is a nice blend of classical literature and romanticism, because it has that nobleness of epic writer Homer, and it has that simplicity of thought and diction as the romantic writers. It is successful in emphasizing his idea of unity of impression. So a lot of things are united and are put together in this poem, and these impressions which we can see in his poem Sohrab and Rustum are the truth of its oriental color. So we see the oriental effect, the deep pathos of the situation, the feelings that are related to the situation where this poem is put into, the fire and intensity of action. We also see the action like epics, the strong conception of character. The character of Sohrab and Rustum are reflected in this poem, and full solemn music of the verse and the verse form. All these things together make it unquestionably the masterpiece of Arnold's longer poems. The unity of classic form with romantic feeling is present in Sohrab and Rustum. So we see blend of both these uh, areas, from the classical literature and from the romantic literature, uh, very carefully blended in this poem, Sohrab and Rustum. Before we start with the text, let's have a look at what this poem is about. Sohrab and Rustum is an extract from 892-line epic poem in blank verse by Mathew Arnold, published in 1853 in his collection poems. So the poem Sohrab and Rustum, which you have in your course, is not complete poem Sohrab and Rustum. Rather, it's an extract from 892-line epic poem, which is also titled Sohrab and Rustum, and it was published in 1853 in his collection poems. The poem retells a famous episode from Firdausi's Persian epic Shahnameh, relating how the great warrior Rustum unknowingly slew his long-lost son Sohrab in a single combat. But this poem, in English, retells a famous episode which Firdausi, who was a Persian writer, he has written his epic named Shahnameh, and in that epic he has written a story about warrior Rustum, how he slays his long-lost son Sohrab in a combat. Arnold, who was unable to read the original, relied on summaries of the story in John Malcolm's History of Persia and Saint Bue's review of French prose translation of Firdausi. So Mathew Arnold did not read the original writing of Firdausi, rather he has relied upon the translation of John Malcolm's History of Persia and Saint Bue's review of French prose translation of Firdausi. In Sohrab and Rustum, Arnold attempts to imitate grandeur and rapidity of Homer's style. Homer is a famous epic poet, as we all know, and Arnold, he has attempted that same grandeur and rapidity of an epic writer. The poem is an account of Sohrab's search for his father, who disappeared years earlier. Basically, this poem begins with Sohrab, who is in search of his father, who disappeared years before. A warrior for the Tartars, Sohrab engages in battle with Persian forces. So Sohrab is on the Tartar side, and his father, that is Rustum, is a Persian warrior. Not realizing that Rustum, the Persian chieftain, is his father, Sohrab challenges the older man in a single combat, and unknowingly they both have a combat. Only when the young warrior lies mortally wounded from Rustum's spear, because Rustum is father, and we see that Rustum unknowingly slays his son, and Sohrab is just on the verge of death. At that moment, he talks of his birth, and then that father and son realize their relationship. So it's very, you can say that's full of emotions, that when the son is dying, father and son, they realize their relationship. So let's have a look at the poem itself. Coming to the text of the poem, as you know that you don't have this full poem of 892 lines in your course, rather you have an extract of it. So the extract, which is there in your course, starts with the time when Sohrab is mortally wounded by his father, Rustum. So it begins like this. He spoke, and Sohrab smiled on him, and took the spear, and drew it from his side, and eased his wound in imperious anguish. Because Sohrab is wounded with a spear on his side, which is put by Rustum during their combat, Sohrab knows that Rustum is his father. He smiled on him, and he takes out the spear and draws it out from his side, and eased his wounds imperious anguish. There is a royal pain because they are in a combat, and this combat was designed that whosoever lives, the army of that side will be considered as victorious, rather than putting both the armies in a battle. So this is an imperious anguish. It's a royal pain which he feels, but the blood came welling from the open gash, and life flowed with the stream. Arnold gives a detailed description to the removing of spear from Sohrab's side, and one can see as readers also that in this open gash, in the open cut on his body, uh, blood wells up and starts flowing in a stream, and as this blood is flowing from his wound, life also is flowing and is coming to an end. All down his cold white side, because his body is having lot of blood loss, so his body is turning white and blood is flowing out of his body in a stream, and with it it's taking away the life of Sohrab. The crimson torrent ran. The quickness of blood loss is compared to a torrent which is red in color, and this blood is flowing from Sohrab's body. Dim now and soiled, like the soiled tissue of white violets, left freshly gathered on their native bank by children whom their nurses call with haste indoors from the sun's eye. His head drooped low, his limbs grew slack, motionless, while he lay white with eyes closed, only when heavy gasps, deep heavy gasps, quivering through all his frame, convulsed him back to life. As we know that Arnold employs the grandeur of epic writers like Homer, so here we have a fine example of Homeric simile, or you can also say epic simile, which Arnold has used in this poem. Basically, when we talk about simile, we know that poet compares something to another thing, but epic simile or Homeric simile means that poet compares something to the another thing, and then he talks in detail about that other thing. Here he's comparing Sohrab to white violets, and then he gives detail about those white violets. So it's a nice example of Homeric simile or epic simile. We also call it long tail simile because there's a detail, there's a length. The comparison goes for few lines, it's not there in just a single phrase. So here he compares Sohrab's untimely death to the white violets, because the blood is gushing out from his body, and he's now comparing Sohrab to white violets. He says, dim now and soiled, like soiled tissue of white violets, left freshly gathered on their native bank by children whom their nurses call with haste. So small children, they gather these white violets from the bank of some river, and as soon as the nurses call them, quickly they go indoor from the sun's eye because it's hot outside, and the nurses call children to come back to their home, in the shelter of their home, and these white violets, they are thrown on the native banks from where they are gathered, and these violets face untimely death because they are gathered and they are lying uselessly on the bank of river. In the same manner, Sohrab is in the youth of his life, and he is now slain by his father, and he is now slowly dying because there is a lot of blood loss. And very finely he compares these flowers to the condition of Sohrab. His head drooped low. Just when the flowers are dying, the heads of the flowers, they droop low, and the stems, they grow slack. In the same manner, the limbs of Sohrab, they grow slack. Motionless, white, he lay, white with eyes closed. Sohrab is facing his untimely death, just like white violets, they face untimely end of their lives when they are just thrown by children on the bank of river. Only when heavy gasps, deep heavy gasps, quivering through all his frame. So he's taking his last breaths, the heavy breaths, and these heavy breaths are coming out of his body in a quivering manner, convulse him back to life. Somewhere there is the last moments of his life, in these last breaths that he's breathing, they are convulsing him back to life. He's somewhere, we see that they give him a little spark of life which is coming back to him, and he is just about to die. So there's a nice emotional scene over here, and the comparison of flowers fading and Sohrab dying is there over here. We'll continue this poem in my next session.